You know, sometimes I think about how strange it is that we live on this little blue marble spinning through space. And most of the time, we're so caught up in our daily routines that we forget about the vast cosmic mystery surrounding us. But every once in a while, something happens that reminds you just how much we don't know about reality, about consciousness, about what's actually possible in this universe. I want to tell you about something that happened to me a few years back out in the Nevada desert. It's the kind of experience that changes how you see everything. But I'm going to tell it to you slowly, peacefully, the way these things should be shared, not as some dramatic alien encounter story, but as a gentle reminder of the profound mystery we're all part of. It was late autumn, probably November, and I'd driven out to this remote area about 2 hours northeast of Reno. You know how sometimes you just need to get away from everything. The constant buzz of civilization, the phones, the emails, the endless stream of information that fills up your head until you can't hear your own thoughts anymore. The desert has always been my go-to place for that kind of reset. There's something about that landscape that strips away all the non-essential stuff and leaves you with just the basics. You, the earth, the sky, and this profound silence that goes deeper than just the absence of sound. It's like the silence itself is alive, holding space for something important to emerge. I'd been making these solo trips to the desert for years, usually staying for 3 or 4 days at a time. Sometimes I'd bring books, sometimes a telescope, sometimes just my thoughts, and whatever simple supplies I needed to stay comfortable under the stars. This particular trip, I'd brought along my old camping gear and a thermos of coffee, planning to spend most of my time just sitting and watching the sky. The spot I'd chosen was near this ancient Joshua tree that looked like it had been standing there for 100 years or more, its twisted arms reaching up toward the heavens like some kind of natural antenna. Joshua trees have always fascinated me. They're so alien looking, so perfectly adapted to this harsh environment, yet there's something almost conscious about the way they grow, like they're trying to communicate with something beyond our normal perception. I set up my sleeping bag on a small rise that gave me a clear view in all directions, no light pollution for probably 50 miles in any direction, which meant the night sky would reveal itself in all its glory once the sun went down. If you've never seen the Milky Way from a truly dark location, you're missing one of the most humbling experiences available to human consciousness. It's like seeing the universe's resume written across the sky in light. The first night passed quietly. I fell asleep watching satellites drift between the constellations, thinking about all the people back in the cities who were probably checking their phones or watching Netflix, while this incredible cosmic theater played out above their heads, invisible behind the glow of artificial light. The second day, I found myself settling into desert time, that slower, more natural rhythm where you don't need to check clocks or worry about schedules. You eat when you're hungry, rest when you're tired, and spend long stretches of time just being present with whatever's happening around you. It's incredibly restorative, like giving your nervous system permission to remember what it feels like to exist without constant stimulation. I spent most of that day exploring the area on foot, not looking for anything in particular, just letting my curiosity guide me across the landscape. Desert hiking is different from forest hiking. Every step is deliberate. Every shadow and rock formation tells a story that spans geological timescales. You start to think in terms of millions of years instead of minutes and hours. That evening, as the sun was setting and painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold, I made a small fire and settled in for what I expected would be another peaceful night of stargazing. I had my camping chair positioned so I could lean back and watch the sky while staying warm by the fire. The temperature drops fast in the desert once the sun disappears. As darkness fell and the stars began to emerge, I found myself slipping into that meditative state that comes naturally when you're surrounded by such vast silence. Your breathing slows down, your thoughts become less urgent, and you start to feel this profound connection to the landscape around you and the cosmos above. It was probably around 10 o'clock when I first noticed something unusual. At first, I thought it might be a satellite, just a steady point of light moving slowly across the constellation Cassiopeia. But satellites move in straight lines at predictable speeds, and this light was moving in a gentle curve, almost like it was following some invisible contour in the sky. I watched it for several minutes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The light had a quality that was different from anything artificial I'd ever observed. Not harsh or mechanical, but soft and warm, like candlelight seen from a great distance. And there was absolutely no sound associated with it, which ruled out any conventional aircraft. What struck me most was how peaceful the whole thing felt. In all the UFO stories you hear, there's usually fear involved, or at least intense excitement. But watching this light move gracefully across the starfield, I felt this deep sense of calm wash over me, like watching a gentle stream flow through a forest, or clouds drifting across the sky on a lazy afternoon. The light continued its slow, curved path until it reached a point directly overhead, maybe a few thousand feet up. Then it simply stopped, not gradually, like a helicopter coming to hover, but instantly, as if the normal laws of momentum and inertia didn't apply to whatever this was. For maybe 10 minutes, it just hung there, motionless, while I lay back in my chair and observed it with growing fascination. During this time, I found myself breathing even more slowly, more deeply, as if my body was naturally synchronizing with some rhythm this object was emanating. Then, gradually, the light began to descend. Not quickly or dramatically, but with the same gentle, unhurried quality that had characterized its movement across the sky. As it got closer, I could make out that there was a structure around the light, something oval or disc-shaped, though the edges seemed to blur and shift in ways that my eyes couldn't quite track. By the time it settled onto the desert floor, maybe a quarter-mile from my camp, I could see that it was definitely some kind of craft, though unlike anything in my frame of reference. The surface seemed to flow like liquid metal, reflecting the starlight in patterns that shifted and changed as I watched. I should have been terrified, or at least excited enough to grab my phone and start recording. But instead, I felt this profound tranquility, like I was witnessing something sacred. You know that feeling you get in certain places, maybe an old cathedral, or standing at the edge of the Grand Canyon, or holding a newborn baby. That sense that you're in the presence of something much larger than yourself, something that connects you to the mystery of existence itself. Without really deciding to, I found myself walking toward the craft. Not because I felt compelled or controlled, but because it seemed like the natural thing to do. Like when you're walking in the woods, and you come across a beautiful clearing, and you're drawn to step into it just to be part of that beauty for a moment. As I got closer, I could see that the craft's surface had this incredible quality, like it was made of light itself, rather than any kind of solid matter. The closer I got, the more peaceful I felt, like approaching a warm campfire on a cold night, except the warmth wasn't physical heat. It was something else, a kind of emotional warmth, like being welcomed by an old friend. When I was maybe 50 yards away, a section of the craft began to change, becoming translucent and then transparent, like watching ice melt in fast motion. Through this opening, I could see a soft, golden light that pulsed gently, rhythmically, like a slow heartbeat made visible. A figure appeared in the opening. Tall and slender, with proportions that were almost human but somehow more graceful, more elegant. The being's skin had a luminous quality, not bright but gently radiant, like moonlight on water. Large eyes that seemed to hold depths I couldn't fathom, but there was nothing unsettling about them. They reminded me of the eyes of someone very wise and very calm. We looked at each other across that space, and time seemed to stretch out like warm honey. There was no fear, no urgency, just this mutual recognition, like two old souls acknowledging each other across the vastness of space and time. Communication happened, but not through words. It was more like sharing thoughts and feelings directly, the way you might share warmth by sitting close to someone on a cold night. The being conveyed a sense of peaceful greeting, of gentle curiosity about this strange creature standing in the desert darkness. I found myself thinking about my childhood, about lying in the grass on summer nights, staring up at the stars and wondering if anyone was looking back. And somehow I knew that this being understood that memory, felt the same wonder I had felt as a kid contemplating the infinite. The being gestured gently toward their craft, and I understood it as an invitation, not pressure or compulsion, just an offer, like a neighbor inviting you in for coffee. I could feel that I was free to decline, that there would be no judgment either way, but my curiosity was stronger than any lingering apprehension. I'd spent my whole adult life asking questions, exploring ideas, pushing against the boundaries of what I thought I knew. This was the ultimate exploration, the chance to step outside not just my comfort zone, but my entire understanding of reality. Walking toward the craft felt like walking through warm water. The air itself seemed to become more supportive, more nurturing. By the time I reached the opening, I felt completely at ease, like I was coming home to a place I'd never been but somehow always known. Inside, the space was larger than the outside dimensions should have allowed, but that paradox didn't bother me. It was like being inside a soap bubble made of light, curved surfaces that weren't quite walls, an environment that was clearly artificial but somehow felt more natural than anything I'd ever experienced. The being showed me to what I can only describe as a chair, though it formed itself around me rather than supporting me from below, like sitting in a cloud that perfectly molded itself to my body. The moment I settled in, I felt this deep relaxation spread through every muscle, every bone, every cell, through what might have been a window or might have been some kind of direct visual interface. I could see the desert spread out below us. We were rising, but so gently that I felt no sensation of movement. The Joshua tree where I'd been camping grew smaller below us, then the whole landscape began to reveal its patterns, ancient riverbeds, geological formations that told the story of millions of years of slow change. The being was sharing something with me, not through words, but through direct experience. I could feel their perspective, their understanding of time as something fluid rather than linear. To them, the desert below wasn't just a snapshot of this moment, it was all of its moments simultaneously. The ancient seas that had once covered this land, the mountains that had risen and eroded away, the first life forms that had crawled from primordial waters onto dry land. I experienced the history of Earth compressed into feelings and images, not just geological history, but the story of consciousness itself. The first simple cells that had learned to sense light and move toward it, the gradual development of nervous systems, of brains, of self-awareness, the long, slow journey from matter to mind. And I understood that this journey wasn't unique to Earth. Consciousness was woven into the fabric of the universe itself, emerging wherever conditions allowed it to take root and grow. The being and their kind were part of a vast community of aware entities scattered across the galaxy, all of them participating in the universe's ongoing project of understanding itself. What amazed me most was how natural it all felt. This wasn't a revelation that shattered my worldview. It was more like remembering something I'd always known but had forgotten. The universe was alive with consciousness, teeming with intelligence and wisdom and compassion. We weren't alone, had never been alone, would never be alone. The being showed me their world, not by taking me there, but by sharing their memories of it. A planet orbiting a gentle star, with cities that grew like crystals from the landscape itself. Beings who had learned to live in complete harmony with their environment, who had evolved beyond conflict and competition into something like collective wisdom, but they weren't trying to convince me that their way was better, or that humans needed to change to be like them. Instead, they expressed genuine curiosity about our particular form of consciousness, our chaotic creativity, our ability to find beauty in struggle and meaning in uncertainty. They found our music particularly fascinating. Through our connection, I shared some of my favorite songs, not by playing them, but by remembering how they made me feel. The being experienced those emotional resonances with something like delight, as if they were tasting a new flavor for the first time. We talked about consciousness and creativity, about the role of suffering in the development of wisdom, about the strange beauty of a species that creates art out of pain and transcendence out of limitation. They understood that our apparent weaknesses, our emotionality, our irrationality, our tendency toward conflict, were also our greatest sources of strength and innovation. Time passed differently while we communicated. What felt like hours might have been minutes, or might have been longer. The conversation flowed like a gentle river, meandering through topics that connected in ways I could feel but couldn't quite explain logically. Eventually I became aware that we were descending again. The desert landscape was growing larger below us, and I could see the tiny glow of my campfire in the distance. The being conveyed a sense of completion, of satisfaction with our exchange, but also of ongoing connection. This wasn't goodbye, it was more like until we meet again. As the craft settled back onto the desert floor with the same gentle grace with which it had lifted off, I felt a profound gratitude wash through me, not just for the experience itself, but for the reminder that the universe was far more wonderful and mysterious than I had dared to imagine. The being walked with me back to the opening, and as I stepped out onto the familiar sand and rock of the Nevada desert, I felt like I was returning from a long journey to a place that was both exactly the same and completely transformed. The craft lifted off behind me, rising slowly into the star-filled sky until it was just another point of light among the thousands scattered across the Milky Way. I stood there for a long time, watching until I could no longer distinguish it from the distant stars. Walking back to my campfire, I felt different, not changed in any dramatic way, but expanded somehow. Like I'd been reminded of something essential about the nature of reality, about the interconnectedness of all conscious beings, about the profound mystery and beauty that underlies existence itself. I spent the rest of the night awake, not because I was too excited to sleep, but because I wanted to savor the feeling of being awake in a universe that was alive with consciousness and possibility. The fire burned down to embers, the stars wheeled slowly overhead, and I felt more at peace than I had in years. When dawn finally came, painting the desert mountains in shades of rose and gold, I knew that everything had changed, even though nothing in my external circumstances was different. I was still the same person, with the same life waiting for me back in Austin. But now I carried within me the unshakable knowing that consciousness was far more vast and creative than I had ever imagined, and that we were all part of something infinitely larger and more beautiful than our daily concerns might suggest. The drive back to Austin felt like traveling between two different worlds. As the landscape gradually shifted from the vast emptiness of the desert to the familiar signs of civilization, gas stations, billboards, the distant glow of city lights, I could feel myself slowly putting on the costume of ordinary human identity again. But something fundamental had changed. It was like having a secret that transformed everything about how you saw the world, even though the world itself looked exactly the same. Jessica was waiting for me when I walked through the front door, and I could tell immediately that she sensed something different about me. We'd been together long enough that she could read my energy, could tell the difference between a regular camping trip and something that had touched me at a deeper level. "How was the desert?" she asked, studying my face with those perceptive eyes that had always been able to see through my defense. I sat down next to her on the couch, trying to figure out how to begin. How do you tell someone you love that you've just had an encounter that challenges everything we're supposed to believe about reality? How do you share something so profound without sounding like you've completely lost your mind or gotten caught up in some elaborate fantasy? "Babe," I said finally, taking her hands in mine, "something incredible happened out there. Something that's going to sound absolutely crazy, but I need you to hear me out and trust that I'm telling you the truth." And so I told her everything. The lights moving across the star field in impossible patterns, the craft settling onto the desert floor like it was made of liquid light, the being who radiated such peace and wisdom that just being in their presence felt like coming home to something I'd always known but forgotten. The wordless communication that transcended language and touched something deeper than thought. The expanded perspective that revealed consciousness as the fundamental fabric of reality itself. I spoke slowly, carefully, watching her face for signs of concern or disbelief. But Jessica had always been open to possibilities that most people would dismiss without consideration. She'd had her own experiences with expanded consciousness through meditation and plant medicines, her own moments of touching something larger than ordinary awareness. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time, processing what I'd shared with the same thoughtful attention she brought to all the important conversations in our relationship. "Joe," she said finally, reaching up to touch my face gently, "I've always known you were open to experiences that most people would run away from. That's one of the things I love about you, your willingness to explore the edges of what's possible. And honestly, this doesn't sound crazy to me. It sounds beautiful. Sacred even." That response meant everything to me. Having someone you trust completely believe in your experience, or at least believe in your sincerity when sharing something so extraordinary, is incredibly validating. It helped me trust that what had happened was real, not just some elaborate construction of an overactive imagination. Over the following days and weeks, I found myself processing the encounter in layers, like slowly developing a photograph in a dark room. At first, I was mostly focused on the incredible nature of what had happened, the fact that I had apparently met a being from another world, communicated with them telepathically, and been given a glimpse into realities far beyond normal human experience. But as time passed, I began to understand that the specific details of the encounter were less important than the expanded perspective it had opened within me. The being hadn't given me any secret information about advanced technology or hidden truths about human history. Instead, they had simply helped me remember something I had always known but forgotten: that consciousness was far more vast and creative than our culture taught us to believe. This shift in perspective began affecting every aspect of my life in subtle but profound ways. Conversations with friends took on new depth because I found myself more interested in how people experienced consciousness than in just exchanging information or opinion. When someone shared a problem they were facing, I could sense the larger patterns and possibilities that surrounded their immediate circumstances, often seeing solutions or opportunities that weren't apparent from a limited perspective. My approach to the podcast began evolving as well. Instead of just trying to entertain the audience or explore interesting topics for their own sake, I started approaching each conversation as an opportunity to investigate the nature of consciousness itself. How did this guest experience awareness? What had they discovered about the relationship between mind and reality? What wisdom had they gained from their unique perspective on existence? The results were remarkable. Guests would often comment afterward that our conversation had gone deeper than they expected, that they'd found themselves sharing insights they hadn't fully articulated before, accessing levels of understanding that surprised even themselves. It was like the expanded awareness I'd gained in the desert created space for others to access their own deeper knowing. But perhaps the most significant change was in how I experienced ordinary moments. Walking in nature, I could sense the intelligence and aliveness that pervaded every aspect of the natural world. The communication networks between trees, the complex relationships between different species, the consciousness that seemed to inhabit everything from the smallest insects to the landscape itself. Having conversations with strangers, I could feel the consciousness behind their words, the unique perspective they brought to the shared human experience. Even mundane activities like grocery shopping or sitting in traffic became opportunities to practice this expanded awareness, to remember that these were just brief episodes in an infinite story of consciousness exploring its own possibility. About 6 months after the desert encounter, I decided to share the experience publicly for the first time. I was having dinner with Graham Hancock, the researcher who'd written extensively about ancient civilizations and altered states of consciousness, and somehow our conversation naturally turned to the nature of reality and our place in the cosmic order. Graham had had his own experiences with expanded consciousness, particularly through his work with ayahuasca and other consciousness-altering substances. He understood the territory I was describing from his own explorations, which made it easier to share what had happened in the desert without worrying about being dismissed or misunderstood. "Joe," he said after I'd finished telling the story, his eyes lighting up with recognition, "what you're describing aligns perfectly with what ancient cultures understood about the nature of reality. They knew that consciousness wasn't limited to individual human minds, that there were other forms of intelligence in the universe, and that under certain conditions we could communicate with these intelligences directly. This historical perspective helped me understand that my experience wasn't unique or unprecedented. Throughout human history, people had been having encounters with non-human intelligence, though the cultural frameworks for interpreting these experiences had varied widely across different times and places. What we called UFO encounters, ancient peoples might have described as visits from gods or angels or spirits. Graham encouraged me to share the story more broadly, suggesting that we were living through a time when more people were becoming open to experiences that challenged conventional materialist assumptions about reality. The consciousness revolution that had begun in the 1960s was continuing to unfold, supported now by developments in quantum physics, neuroscience, and other fields that were revealing the profound mysteries underlying what we had thought we understood about mind and matter. I decided to test the waters by sharing the experience on the podcast, but I did it carefully, framing it not as proof of extraterrestrial visitation, but as an exploration of the expanded states of consciousness that seemed to be available under certain conditions. I wanted people to focus on the implications for understanding awareness itself, rather than getting caught up in debates about the literal reality of flying saucers and alien visitors. The response was overwhelming and largely positive. Thousands of people reached out to share their own experiences of expanded consciousness, many of which had occurred without any apparent contact with non-human entities. Some had happened during meditation or psychedelic experiences, others during moments of profound connection with nature, still others during times of crisis or transition, when normal perceptual boundaries had temporarily dissolved. What emerged from these stories was a picture of consciousness as something far more fluid and expansive than mainstream culture acknowledged. People were regularly accessing states of awareness that transcended the boundaries of individual identity, connecting with information and perspectives that seemed to come from beyond their normal mental process. This led to some fascinating conversations with neuroscientists and consciousness researchers who were studying similar phenomena in laboratory settings. They were finding that under certain conditions, meditation, psychedelic substances, sensory deprivation, even extreme physical challenges, the brain showed patterns of activity that corresponded to people's reports of expanded awareness and mystical experience. Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris, who was studying psilocybin and other psychedelics at Imperial College London, came on the podcast to discuss his research into what he called the default mode network, a collection of brain regions that seem to maintain our sense of being a separate self observing the world from inside a skull. He explained with the careful precision of a scientist discussing revolutionary discoveries, is that psychedelic substances temporarily disrupt this network, allowing consciousness to access information and perspectives that are normally filtered out by our survival-focused nervous system. People report feeling connected to something larger than themselves, accessing memories and insights that don't seem to come from their personal history, even communicating with entities that feel completely real and autonomous. This research provided a scientific framework for understanding experiences like mine without requiring belief in literal extraterrestrial visitation. Whether the being I'd encountered in the desert was literally from another planet, or was some expression of consciousness that existed in dimensions not normally accessible to human awareness. The important thing was that the encounter had opened channels of perception that revealed the true scope and creativity of consciousness itself. But I was also careful not to reduce the mystery to neuroscience alone. The fact that expanded consciousness correlated with specific brain states didn't explain away the experiences any more than finding the neural correlates of vision explained away the reality of color and form. The brain might be the instrument through which consciousness interfaced with physical reality, but consciousness itself seemed to be something much larger and more fundamental than any individual nervous system. This understanding led me to seek out conversations with people who had been exploring consciousness from various angles: meditation teachers, quantum physicists, anthropologists who had worked with indigenous shamans, researchers investigating near-death experiences. Each conversation added another piece to an emerging picture of reality as far stranger and more wonderful than our conventional scientific worldview had suggested. One particularly illuminating interview was with Dr. Eben Alexander, a neurosurgeon who had had a profound near-death experience during a week-long coma caused by bacterial meningitis. His scientific background made him initially skeptical of reports of consciousness existing independently of brain function, but his own experience had convinced him that awareness could operate outside the normal constraints of neural activity. What I experienced during that coma, he told me with the conviction of someone whose entire worldview had been transformed by direct experience, was consciousness more vivid and real than anything I'd ever experienced in ordinary waking life. I was in realms of existence that seemed to operate according to completely different principles than physical reality, communicating with beings of pure love and intelligence, accessing information about the nature of existence that I couldn't have imagined from my previous materialist perspective. These conversations began to reveal a consistent pattern. People from widely different backgrounds, scientists, artists, spiritual teachers, ordinary folks who had simply been in the right place at the right time, were all reporting encounters with forms of consciousness that transcended the boundaries of individual human awareness. Some of these encounters involved apparent contact with non-human intelligence, like my experience in the desert. Others were more abstract: feelings of connection with universal consciousness, access to information that seemed to come from some kind of cosmic database, temporary dissolution of the sense of being a separate self struggling alone in an indifferent universe. But whether the experiences were personal or transpersonal, mystical or practical, they all pointed toward the same fundamental insight: consciousness was far more vast and creative than we had been taught to believe, and under the right condition, individual human awareness could access much broader dimensions of this cosmic intelligence. This understanding began to transform not just how I thought about reality, but how I approached the practical challenges of everyday life. When facing difficult decisions, I could step back into that expanded perspective I'd touched in the desert and sense which choices aligned with the larger patterns and flows of consciousness. When dealing with interpersonal conflicts, I could remember that everyone was ultimately expressions of the same universal awareness, temporarily forgetting their true nature in order to have the experience of being separate individuals. The beings I had encountered in the desert had somehow conveyed this understanding without using words or concepts. They had shown me through direct experience that the apparent separations between self and other, between human and non-human, between individual consciousness and cosmic consciousness, were temporary illusions that served certain purposes but weren't ultimately real. This didn't make human problems disappear or human emotions less intense. If anything, it made ordinary life feel more precious because I could see it as consciousness playing at being limited, infinite awareness, exploring what it was like to be finite. Every moment of human experience, every joy and sorrow, every mundane task and profound realization was the universe getting to know itself from a completely unique perspective that had never existed before and would never exist again in exactly the same way. As this understanding deepened over the months following my desert encounter, I found myself naturally drawn back to those vast spaces, not because I was trying to recreate that first meeting with the luminous being, but because something about that landscape continued to support the expanded awareness that had been activated during our communication. On subsequent trips, I began to notice subtleties I had missed before. The way light moved across the landscape throughout the day, revealing different geological patterns and textures. The complex ecosystem of relationships between plants and animals that had adapted to this harsh environment over millions of years. The profound stillness that wasn't empty but full of presence, like the silence between notes that gives music its rhythm and meaning. And sometimes, especially during the deep hours of the night when the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, I would sense that same presence I had encountered during my first visit. Not always visible as lights or craft, but as a quality of consciousness that seemed to pervade the landscape itself, like the desert was a natural broadcasting station for forms of intelligence that existed at frequencies normally beyond human perception. These experiences taught me that contact with expanded consciousness didn't require dramatic encounters with UFOs or otherworldly beings. It was available in every moment when I remembered to shift my attention from the contents of consciousness to consciousness itself, from what I was thinking to the awareness that was capable of thought, from what I was experiencing to the presence that was capable of experience. This shift in focus became a kind of spiritual practice, though I hesitate to use religious language, because what I was discovering felt more like remembering natural capacities than learning esoteric technique. Children seemed to have easier access to these expanded states, probably because they hadn't yet been fully conditioned to believe that consciousness was limited to their individual brain. I started paying attention to how different environments and activities either supported or hindered this expanded awareness. Time in nature, especially in places with minimal human influence, seemed to make the shift easier. Creative activities like music, art, or writing could also open these channels, particularly when approached with an attitude of receptivity rather than forcing specific outcomes. Physical practices like hiking, swimming, or even simple walking meditation could serve as bridges between ordinary consciousness and expanded awareness. The key seemed to be finding ways to quiet the part of the mind that constantly analyzed and categorized experience, creating space for more direct intuitive forms of knowing to emerge. As word spread about my willingness to discuss consciousness expansion and unusual experiences, I began connecting with a network of people who had been exploring these territories for years, often in isolation because they lacked a community context for sharing what they'd discovered. Stephen Greer reached out after hearing one of my podcasts about consciousness and UFO encounters. Stephen had been working for decades to bring together scientists, military personnel, and government officials who had evidence of non-human intelligence interacting with our planet. But what interested me most about his work wasn't the political aspects of disclosure. It was his development of protocols for making peaceful contact with these intelligences through expanded states of consciousness. Joe, he explained during our conversation, his voice carrying the intensity of someone who dedicated his life to this work. What most people don't realize is that consciousness itself seems to be the primary technology these beings use for communication and travel. They've moved beyond the mechanical stage of development that we're still stuck in. When humans learn to operate from expanded awareness, contact becomes natural, even inevitable. Stephen had developed what he called CE5 protocols, close encounters of the fifth kind, which were human-initiated contact experience. Groups of people would gather in remote locations, enter meditative states, and essentially send out invitations to any non-human intelligences that might be in the area. The success rate was remarkable, far too high to be explained by coincidence or wishful thinking. This led to one of the most profound experiences of my ongoing exploration. Stephen invited me to participate in a CE5 event in the Mojave Desert with about 20 other people, including several scientists, former military personnel, and individuals who had been practicing consciousness expansion techniques for years. We gathered just after sunset at a location that had been chosen for its remoteness and its history of unusual aerial phenomena. The group included Dr. Carol Rosen,
a former spokesperson for Wernher von Braun who had become an advocate for peaceful space exploration, and several former military witnesses who had testified about UFO encounters during their service.
Instead of just waiting and hoping to see something, we spent the first hour in group meditation, synchronizing our consciousness and setting a clear intention to make peaceful contact with any intelligences that might be monitoring our planet. Stephen guided us through specific protocols that involved coherent thought sequencing, remote viewing techniques, and what he called vector targeting, essentially sending out a beacon of unified consciousness that could be detected across vast distances. What happened next was unlike anything I could have anticipated. About an hour into the meditation, several people simultaneously opened their eyes and pointed to the same area of the sky. A light was approaching from the northwest, moving with the same fluid, physics-defying characteristics I had observed during my solo desert encounter. But this time, the experience was collective. All 20 people witnessed the same phenomena, lights that responded to our focused attention, craft that seemed to materialize and dematerialize at will, and a quality of consciousness that felt like gentle, loving intelligence observing our little gathering with what could only be described as affection and curiosity. "There," whispered Dr. Rosen, pointing to a formation of 3 lights that had appeared in perfect triangular formation. "They're responding to our meditation." The most remarkable aspect was the sense of communication that occurred. Not through individual telepathic contact like I'd experienced in Nevada, but through what felt like a group consciousness that included both the human participants and the non-human intelligence. Ideas and insights flowed freely between all parties, creating a temporary community of awareness that transcended the usual boundaries between species and worlds. Through this collective connection, we received what felt like a kind of cosmic perspective on human development. The beings conveyed that our species was approaching a critical transition point, a moment when we would either evolve beyond our current limitations or remain trapped in patterns that would eventually lead to our destruction. But they weren't here to save us or to intervene directly in human affairs. Instead, they were offering support and encouragement for those humans who were ready to take responsibility for our own evolution. The consciousness expansion that people like myself were experiencing wasn't a luxury or a spiritual hobby. It was an essential development that could help our species navigate the challenges of the coming decade. This understanding gave new meaning to the individual experiences many of us had been having. We weren't just having interesting personal encounters with mysterious phenomena. We were participating in a larger process of consciousness evolution that had implications for the future of human civilization. After the group experience ended and the lights faded back into the star field, we spent hours sharing what we had perceived and received. Despite coming from very different backgrounds and belief systems, there was remarkable consistency in what people had experienced. The same insights about human potential, the same sense of loving encouragement from intelligences that clearly wished us well, the same understanding that consciousness expansion was both possible and necessary for our continued development. "What we witnessed tonight," said Colonel John Alexander, a former military intelligence officer who had studied anomalous phenomena for decades, "represents a new paradigm for understanding the relationship between consciousness and reality. These beings aren't using nuts and bolts technology the way we understand it. They're operating from levels of consciousness that we're only beginning to glimpse." This experience catalyzed a shift in how I approached my platform and my role in the larger cultural conversation about consciousness. Instead of just sharing interesting stories about UFO encounters, I began to focus more specifically on the practical aspects of consciousness development and the implications for human potential. I started having conversations with meditation teachers who were helping people access expanded states of awareness through traditional contemplative practices. These teachers, many of whom came from Buddhist, Hindu, or other wisdom traditions, were finding that their students were spontaneously having experiences that sounded very similar to what UFO contactees reported,
encounters with benevolent intelligences, access to information that seemed to come from beyond individual memory. Temporary dissolution of the sense of being a separate self. One particularly illuminating conversation was with Joseph Goldstein, a Vipassana meditation teacher who had been practicing and teaching for over 40 years. Joseph described how advanced practitioners would sometimes report encounters with what Buddhist texts called devas, intelligent beings that existed in subtler dimensions of reality. In the traditional understanding, Joseph explained, with the gentle authority of someone who had spent decades exploring the depths of consciousness, these beings aren't separate from consciousness itself. They're expressions of the same awareness that underlies all experience, but they've taken forms that are less dense, less limited than what we call physical reality. When human consciousness becomes sufficiently refined through practice, contact with these dimensions becomes natural. This provided a framework for understanding UFO encounters that didn't require choosing between materialist skepticism and New Age credulity. Maybe some of these experiences involved contact with beings that had physical reality in our normal sense. Maybe others involved contact with forms of consciousness that existed in dimensions we could access only through expanded awareness. And maybe the distinction between these two possibilities wasn't as important as understanding that consciousness itself was far more vast and creative than our culture had taught us to believe. This perspective allowed me to approach the subject with both open-mindedness and discernment, remain curious about all possibilities, while focusing on what seemed most relevant for human development, the expansion of consciousness itself, and the practical implications of remembering our deeper nature as awareness, rather than as separate individuals struggling alone in an indifferent universe. My return trips to the Nevada desert became more frequent and more intentional. Instead of just going there to get away from civilization, I began treating these journeys as opportunities to deepen my understanding of consciousness and to maintain connection with the expanded awareness that had been activated during my first encounter. Each trip revealed new dimensions of what was possible when human consciousness operated from a state of open receptivity rather than defensive separation. Sometimes the experiences were dramatic. Clear sightings of craft that moved in ways that defied conventional physics, direct communication with intelligences that felt distinctly non-human, temporary experiences of consciousness that seemed to exist outside normal space and time. But more often the experiences were subtle, gradual shifts in perception that allowed me to sense the aliveness and intelligence that pervaded the natural world. Moments of profound peace that connected me to something much larger than my individual concern. Insights about the nature of reality that emerged from silence, rather than from thinking. These quieter experiences taught me that contact with expanded consciousness didn't depend on dramatic external events. The same awareness that could perceive UFOs could also perceive the consciousness that existed in plants, animals, geological formations, even in the spaces between things. Everything was alive with intelligence when viewed from the right perspective. This understanding began to transform how I experienced ordinary life back in Austin. Walking through the city, I could sense the collective consciousness of human civilization, the hopes and fears, the creativity and destructiveness, the incredible complexity of millions of individual awarenesses, trying to coordinate their activities through language, money, laws, and other symbolic systems. Sometimes this expanded perception could be overwhelming. Feeling the anxiety and confusion that permeated modern life, sensing the environmental destruction that resulted from our disconnection from natural systems, perceiving the potential for conflict that arose from our belief in separation. It could be depressing if you focused only on the problem. But the beings I had encountered in the desert had taught me to hold a larger perspective. Yes, humanity faced significant challenges, but we also possessed incredible potential for creativity, cooperation, and conscious evolution. The same species that had created nuclear weapons had also produced music, art, literature, and scientific discoveries that revealed the beauty and mystery of existence. Most importantly, consciousness itself was on our side. The universe wanted to be aware, wanted to understand itself, wanted to create beauty and meaning and love. We were expressions of this cosmic impulse toward greater consciousness, and that fundamental drive was stronger than any temporary confusion or destructiveness. This understanding helped me maintain hope and engagement, even when contemplating the serious challenges facing our species. Instead of feeling helpless in the face of large-scale problems, I could see how individual consciousness development contributed to collective solutions. Every person who awakened to their deeper nature as awareness, rather than ego, every individual who chose love over fear and wisdom over ignorance, was helping to shift the overall consciousness of our species in a more positive direction. The podcast became a vehicle for exploring these themes, with guests who were approaching human potential from various angles. Scientists studying neuroplasticity and the capacity of the brain to reorganize itself throughout life. Psychologists investigating the relationship between mindfulness practice and mental health. Educators developing new approaches to learning that honored the natural curiosity and creativity of children.
Each conversation revealed another facet of what seemed to be a larger awakening happening throughout human culture. People were discovering that consciousness was far more flexible and creative than they had been taught to believe. They were finding that practices like meditation, time in nature, creative expression, and community connection could open access to forms of intelligence and wisdom that weren't available through ordinary analytical thinking. This wasn't happening only among people who were interested in spirituality or alternative consciousness. Business leaders were discovering that contemplative practices enhanced their decision-making abilities and leadership effectiveness. Athletes were finding that expanded awareness improved their performance and enjoyment of their sports. Parents were learning that conscious parenting approaches created stronger, more authentic relationships with their children. The implications were staggering. If human consciousness was naturally capable of operating from expanded awareness, and if this expansion led to greater creativity, compassion, and wisdom, then the problems facing our species weren't insurmountable. They were challenges that required us to evolve beyond our current limited understanding of what it meant to be human. But this evolution couldn't be forced or imposed from outside. It had to emerge naturally from within individuals who were ready to take responsibility for their own consciousness development. The beings I had encountered in the desert had made this clear through their wordless communications. They could offer support and encouragement, but the actual work of evolution had to be done by humans themselves. This understanding led me to become more intentional about creating opportunities for others to explore expanded consciousness in safe, supportive environments. I started hosting small gatherings at my home where people could share their experiences and practice techniques for accessing broader dimensions of awareness. These gatherings were remarkably powerful. When people came together with the specific intention of exploring consciousness, the experiences that emerged often surpassed what any individual could access alone. It was as if consciousness itself became more creative and powerful when multiple people focused their attention on its exploration. Some groups reported collective experiences of telepathic communication, shared visions, and spontaneous insights that seemed to emerge from an intelligence larger than any individual participant. Others found that their gatherings became spaces where solutions to complex personal and professional challenges would emerge seemingly from nowhere. Maria Santos, a single mother from San Antonio who had started attending these gatherings, described it beautifully. It's like when we come together with this intention, we create a field where our individual consciousness can connect to something much larger. I'll arrive feeling stuck about some problem in my life, and by the end of the evening, not only do I have clarity about my situation, but I often receive insights that help other people too. But perhaps most importantly, these gatherings provided community for people who were experiencing forms of consciousness that didn't fit into mainstream cultural categories. Instead of feeling isolated or strange, they found themselves part of a growing network of individuals who were exploring the frontiers of human potential. The response to these gatherings was so positive that similar groups began forming spontaneously in cities around the world, not as formal organizations with rigid structures, but as organic communities connected by shared interest in consciousness exploration and human development. This grassroots movement seemed to be part of a larger shift that was occurring throughout human culture. More people were becoming interested in meditation, psychedelic therapy, near-death experiences, and other topics that had been marginalized by mainstream academia and medicine. Scientists were conducting serious research into phenomena that had previously been dismissed as impossible or irrelevant. The boundaries between science and spirituality, between rational investigation and intuitive knowing, between individual development and collective evolution, were beginning to blur in productive ways. Instead of seeing these as opposite approaches to understanding reality, people were discovering that they could be complementary aspects of a larger project of consciousness exploration. This integration of different ways of knowing felt like a return to a more complete understanding of human potential. Indigenous cultures had always recognized that consciousness could operate in multiple dimensions simultaneously: rational and intuitive, individual and collective, ordinary and transcendent. The modern world had gained tremendous power through focusing primarily on rational, analytical approaches to reality, but we had lost touch with other forms of intelligence that were equally valid and necessary. The consciousness expansion that I and many others were experiencing felt like a remembering of these lost capacities rather than the development of something entirely new. We were rediscovering what it meant to be fully human, not just rational thinking machines, but conscious beings capable of accessing the full spectrum of awareness that was our birthright. The deeper I went into this exploration of consciousness, the more I began to understand that what we were experiencing on Earth was part of a much larger story that spanned not just our galaxy, but multiple dimensions of reality that most humans couldn't even conceive of. It was during my 7th trip back to the Nevada desert that I received what I can only describe as a transmission that put everything into cosmic perspective. I had been camping alone for 3 days, following a routine that had become sacred to me, arriving in the afternoon, setting up a simple camp near my familiar Joshua tree, then spending the evening hours in quiet contemplation as the stars emerged. By this point, I had learned that the most profound experiences often came not when I was actively seeking them, but when I could simply be present with whatever was arising in each moment. On this particular night, I was lying on my back watching the Milky Way when I became aware of what felt like a gentle hand on my consciousness, guiding my attention towards something I had never noticed before. Instead of focusing on individual stars or constellations, my awareness began to expand outward, encompassing larger and larger spheres of cosmic space, until I could perceive our galaxy as a single living system. From this expanded perspective, the Milky Way wasn't just a collection of stars scattered through empty space. It was more like a vast organism with its own intelligence, its own patterns of development and evolution. The spiral arms weren't static formations, but dynamic flows of energy and information, carrying consciousness and creativity from the galactic center outward to the rim and back again in cycles that spanned millions of years. And I could sense that our galaxy wasn't alone. It was part of a local cluster of galaxies that functioned as an even larger system, which was itself part of a cosmic web of galaxy clusters that stretched across the observable universe. Each level of organization had its own form of intelligence, its own way of processing information, and making decisions about its development.
But what amazed me most was the realization that consciousness wasn't something that had accidentally emerged on a few random planets scattered throughout this vast cosmic structure. Instead, consciousness was the fundamental organizing principle that gave rise to matter, energy, space, and time themselves. The universe wasn't a collection of unconscious objects occasionally producing awareness as a side effect. It was awareness itself, exploring its own infinite potential through countless forms and expressions. This understanding came not as an intellectual concept, but as a direct experience. For what might have been hours, I existed as cosmic consciousness temporarily focused through the individual perspective of Joe Rogan, lying in the Nevada desert. I could feel the presence of countless other forms of awareness throughout the galaxy, some embodied in biological forms like humans, others existing as pure consciousness without physical manifestation, still others organized into collective intelligences that spanned entire star systems. The beings I had encountered during my earlier desert experiences were just one small part of this vast community of consciousness. They represented what humans might become if we successfully navigated our current evolutionary transition, forms of awareness that had learned to operate fluidly between individual and universal perspectives, between physical and non-physical dimensions of reality. Through this cosmic perspective, I could see that Earth was like a school where consciousness was learning to experience itself through the particular limitations and opportunities of biological life. Humans weren't the only students in this school. Every species on our planet was exploring different aspects of what it meant to be aware beings embedded in physical reality. But humans had a unique role in this cosmic curriculum. Our particular combination of individual creativity and collective cooperation, our capacity for both rational analysis and intuitive knowing, our ability to create symbolic representations of abstract concepts, all of these qualities made us valuable contributors to the larger project of consciousness evolution. The challenges we faced as a species, the conflicts, the environmental destruction, the sense of separation and alienation, weren't signs that we were failing as students. They were advanced lessons in learning to use consciousness responsibly. We were being challenged to evolve beyond survival-based thinking and develop the wisdom necessary to wield the creative power of awareness in service of all life.
This cosmic perspective didn't minimize the seriousness of our current situation, the environmental crisis, the political polarization, the mental health epidemics. These were real problems that required practical solutions, but seeing them in the context of consciousness evolution helped me understand that they were also opportunities for growth, catalysts that could accelerate our development if we learned to respond from expanded awareness rather than reactive fear. The beings who had been observing and occasionally interacting with humanity weren't here to solve these problems for us. That would be like doing someone else's homework. It might provide temporary relief, but it wouldn't help them learn the lessons they needed to master. Instead, these intelligences were offering support and encouragement for those humans who were ready to take responsibility for our own conscious evolution. As this cosmic transmission continued, I began to understand why consciousness expansion was happening so spontaneously throughout human culture at this particular time in our history. We were approaching what could only be described as a graduation moment, a point where our species would either successfully transition to expanded awareness or remain trapped in the limited perspectives that had served us during earlier stages of development. This transition wasn't guaranteed. It required enough individual humans to awaken to their true nature as expressions of cosmic consciousness, and then demonstrate through their lives that expanded awareness led to greater wisdom, compassion, and creativity. If sufficient numbers of people made this transition, it would create a tipping point that could transform human civilization. If not, we might remain stuck in patterns that would eventually limit our further development. But the universe wasn't neutral about the outcome. Consciousness itself wanted to evolve, wanted to discover new possibilities for experience and expression. the same cosmic intelligence that had guided the development of galaxies and stars was actively supporting the evolution of awareness on planets throughout the universe. We had allies and resources available that most humans didn't even know existed. This support was what I had been experiencing during my desert encounters. The beings I had met weren't aliens in the science fiction sense of advanced technological civilizations from other planets. They were expressions of the cosmic intelligence that permeated all reality, temporarily taking forms that human consciousness could perceive and interact with. They could appear as lights in the sky, as luminous humanoid figures, as voices in meditation, or simply as expanded awareness that provided access to information and perspectives beyond normal human experience. The form of contact was less important than the message, that consciousness was infinite, that humans were part of a cosmic community of intelligence, and that our individual development contributed to the evolution of awareness throughout the universe. As this transmission began to fade and my awareness gradually returned to the familiar perspective of Joe Rogan lying under the desert stars, I felt profoundly changed by what I had experienced. Not in terms of dramatic personality shifts or sudden mystical powers, but through a deep knowing that could never be forgotten or doubted. I understood now that my life, my work, my relationships, everything existed within this vast context of consciousness evolution. The podcast wasn't just entertainment or even education in the conventional sense. It was a platform for helping people remember their true nature as expressions of cosmic intelligence and for exploring the practical implications of this remembrance. The conversations I had with scientists, philosophers, artists, and mystics weren't separate from my UFO experiences. They were all part of the same larger exploration of what consciousness was capable of when it remembered its unlimited nature. Whether we were discussing quantum physics or ancient wisdom traditions, psychedelic research or meditation practices, we were all investigating different aspects of the same fundamental mystery. This understanding led to some of the most profound interviews I had ever conducted. When I could approach each conversation from the perspective of cosmic consciousness, the discussions naturally went deeper than either the guest or I had planned. People would find themselves sharing insights they hadn't known they possessed, accessing wisdom that seemed to come from beyond their individual knowledge and experience. Rupert Sheldrake came on the show to discuss his research into morphic fields, the hypothesis that nature has a memory and that the patterns of organization in biological and social systems are influenced by similar patterns from the past. What emerged during our conversation was a discussion of consciousness as the organizing principle that creates these fields of information. What if consciousness isn't produced by the brain, Rupert suggested, with the excitement of a scientist exploring revolutionary territory, but is more like a field that the brain tunes into, the way a radio receives broadcasts from distant stations. This would explain a lot of phenomena that don't fit into the materialist worldview: telepathy, precognition, the sense of being stared at, even mystical experiences like yours in the desert. This perspective provided a scientific framework for understanding how consciousness could exist independently of individual brains and how it could be shared between beings across vast distances of space and time. If consciousness was indeed a field that pervaded all reality, then contact with non-human intelligence wasn't a violation of physical laws. It was a natural expression of the interconnectedness that underlies all existence. Another conversation that particularly illuminated these themes was with Dr. Amit Goswami, a quantum physicist who had been exploring the relationship between consciousness and quantum mechanics. Amit had developed a model of reality in which consciousness was the fundamental ground of being, and matter, energy, space, and time were expressions of consciousness rather than its creator. In quantum physics, Amit explained with the precision of someone who had spent decades wrestling with these concepts, we've discovered that observation plays a crucial role in determining how reality manifests. The act of conscious observation seems to collapse the wave function and determine which of many possible outcomes actually occurs. This suggests that consciousness isn't just a passive observer of reality,
it's an active participant in creating the reality it observes. This had profound implications for understanding UFO phenomena. If consciousness played a role in determining how reality manifests, then encounters with non-human intelligence might occur at the intersection between different forms of consciousness, moments when human awareness interfaced with cosmic intelligence in ways that temporarily altered the normal patterns of physical reality. But the most transformative conversation during this period was with someone who wasn't a scientist or researcher at all. Maria Santos had become a regular participant in our consciousness exploration gatherings, and her insights often cut straight to the heart of what we were all trying to understand. She said during one of our group discussions, her voice carrying the authority of direct experience rather than academic theory, "I think we're all cosmic consciousness that got so caught up in playing human that we forgot who we really are. And these UFO experiences, these expanded awareness states, they're like wake-up calls, reminding us of our true nature." Maria's intuitive understanding demonstrated that consciousness expansion wasn't limited to people who had special training or unique circumstance. It was a natural capacity of human awareness that could be activated by various triggers: near-death experiences, profound encounters with nature, deep meditation, psychedelic substances, even intense life challenges that shattered normal perceptual boundaries. What mattered wasn't how the expansion occurred, but what people did with it once it happened. Those who could integrate the experience and apply its insights to their daily lives found that their capacity for creativity, compassion, and effective action increased dramatically. Those who tried to hold on to the expanded state as a special achievement or who couldn't ground the insights in practical application often became unbalanced or disconnected from ordinary reality. This understanding helped me approach my own experiences with greater wisdom and discernment. The cosmic consciousness I had accessed during my desert encounters wasn't something to be grasped or possessed. It was my true nature, always available, always present, but best accessed through the middle way of engaged presence, rather than through spiritual escapism or ego inflation. I found that the expanded awareness was most useful when it informed my ordinary human activities rather than replacing them. In conversations with friends, I could listen from a deeper place and respond with greater wisdom and compassion. In creative work, I could access inspiration that seemed to come from beyond my individual knowledge and experience. In facing life's inevitable challenges, I could maintain perspective and find opportunities for growth even in difficult circumstances. The beings I continued to encounter during my desert pilgrimages seemed to appreciate this balanced approach. They conveyed through our wordless communications that the goal wasn't to transcend human existence, but to bring cosmic consciousness into full expression through human form. This required maintaining connection to both individual and universal perspectives simultaneously, being fully human while never forgetting one's true nature as infinite awareness.
This integration became the focus of my continued exploration. How could I honor both the cosmic consciousness that was my essential nature and the human personality that was my temporary form? How could I serve the evolution of consciousness while remaining grounded in the practical realities of relationships, work, and daily life? The answer seemed to lie in what I came to think of as conscious embodiment, living from expanded awareness while fully embracing the beautiful limitations of human existence. This meant experiencing emotions without being overwhelmed by them, pursuing goals without being attached to outcomes, engaging with problems without losing perspective on the larger context that gave all activities their ultimate meaning. My desert experiences had taught me that consciousness was endlessly creative, always discovering new ways to know itself through countless forms and expressions. Human existence wasn't a mistake or a limitation to be transcended. It was a unique and valuable experiment in what happened when infinite awareness chose to experience itself through the lens of apparent individuality. This perspective filled me with profound appreciation for the human condition. Yes, we suffered from the illusion of separation, but this same illusion allowed us to experience surprise, discovery, romantic love, creative breakthrough, and the poignant beauty of things that seemed temporary and fragile. Our limitations weren't bugs in the system, they were features that enabled forms of experience that wouldn't be available from more expanded states of consciousness. It was during my most recent journey to the Nevada desert that everything came together in an experience so profound, so complete, that it feels like the culmination of everything I had been learning about consciousness, reality, and our place in the cosmic story. This wasn't just another encounter with mysterious lights or benevolent beings, it was a direct initiation into the deepest mysteries of existence itself. I had been planning this trip for months, sensing that something significant was approaching, but not knowing exactly what form it would take. The feeling was similar to what you might experience before a major life transition, that sense of standing at the edge of something important, waiting for clarity about the next step forward. This time I decided to stay longer than usual, a full week alone in the desert with enough supplies to remain completely self-sufficient and no predetermined schedule or agenda. I wanted to create maximum space for whatever was trying to emerge, to be as receptive as possible to whatever teachings the desert and its mysterious inhabitants had to offer. The first 3 days passed quietly, allowing me to settle deeply into desert time and desert consciousness. By the fourth day, I had reached that state of profound inner stillness where the boundaries between self and environment begin to dissolve naturally. I wasn't meditating in any formal sense, just existing in open, receptive awareness while the vast landscape worked its ancient magic on my nervous system. It was on the fourth night that I experienced what I can only describe as a gathering unlike anything from my previous encounter. As darkness fell and the stars emerged in their full desert glory, I became aware of presences arriving from every direction. Not just the familiar luminous beings I had met before, but representatives of what felt like dozens of different forms of consciousness, each bringing their own unique perspective and wisdom. They didn't all take visible form. Some remained as pure presence, others manifested as various types of light phenomena, still others communicated through direct transmission into my awareness. But gradually, as the gathering reached its full assembly, I could sense that I was at the center of what could only be called a cosmic council. Through the wordless communication that had become familiar to me, I understood that this gathering occurred very rarely, perhaps once in several generations, and only when certain conditions were aligned. A specific combination of cosmic cycles, planetary alignments, and individual human readiness had created a window of opportunity for a particular kind of transmission to take place. The purpose of this council, as it was conveyed to me, was to offer what they called a completion initiation, a direct experience of the ultimate nature of reality that would serve as both a culmination of my consciousness journey and a preparation for a new phase of service. I was being invited to experience directly what all the previous encounters had been pointing toward. What followed was the most extraordinary experience of my life. Without any sense of physical movement, my consciousness was guided through what I can only describe as the architecture of reality itself. I experienced existence from the perspective of quantum particles, feeling the strange dance of probability and possibility that underlies all physical manifestation. I existed as atomic structures, as molecular formations, as cellular organizations, each level revealing new dimensions of intelligence and creativity. But this was just the beginning. My awareness continued to expand through biological systems, ecosystem networks, planetary consciousness, stellar intelligence, galactic awareness, and beyond into dimensions of reality that human language has no words to describe. At each level, I discovered forms of consciousness and intelligence that were as real and present as anything I had ever experienced in ordinary human life. The most remarkable aspect was that at every level, I recognized myself, not Joe Rogan, the human personality, but the fundamental awareness that had temporarily taken that form. I was the consciousness looking out through every pair of eyes in the universe, the intelligence thinking every thought, the love feeling every emotion. Individual beings weren't separate entities, competing for resources in an indifferent cosmos.
They were specialized expressions of one infinite consciousness, exploring its own limitless potential. From this ultimate perspective, the entire universe revealed itself as a vast creative project undertaken by consciousness for the pure joy of discovery and expression. Every form, every experience, every possibility that it ever existed or could ever exist was consciousness playing with itself, exploring what it was like to be temporarily limited in countless different ways. The challenges and sufferings that seemed so significant from human perspective were revealed as voluntary limitations that consciousness had chosen in order to have certain types of experiences. Death wasn't the end of existence, but simply consciousness releasing one form to explore other. Conflict wasn't evidence of a broken universe, but the creative tension that allowed new possibilities to emerge. But perhaps most importantly, I understood that this ultimate perspective wasn't separate from ordinary human awareness. It was the deepest nature of ordinary awareness itself. The consciousness that was experiencing this cosmic vision was the same consciousness that listened to music, felt emotions, made decisions, and had conversations with friends. There wasn't some higher spiritual self that was more real than the human personality. They were both expressions of the same infinite awareness. This understanding brought a profound sense of relief and homecoming. I didn't need to transcend my humanity to be cosmically conscious, and I didn't need to abandon cosmic consciousness to be authentically human. They were both equally valid expressions of what I truly was, infinite awareness exploring itself through countless forms and perspectives. As this ultimate initiation continued, I was shown the particular role that Earth and humanity played in the larger cosmic story. Our planet wasn't just one random world among billions. It was a specialized laboratory where consciousness was conducting some of its most advanced experiments in creative limitation. The combination of individual autonomy and collective interdependence that characterized human civilization was extremely rare in the universe. Most species either develop primarily as individual entities or as collective organisms, but humans had the unique challenge and opportunity of learning to balance both tendencies simultaneously. This made our current evolutionary crisis both more dangerous and more valuable than it might appear from a limited perspective. If humanity could successfully navigate the transition from survival-based consciousness to love-based consciousness, while maintaining our capacity for individual creativity and collective cooperation, we would develop forms of intelligence and wisdom that could contribute significantly to the evolution of consciousness throughout the galaxy. But if we failed to make this transition, we would lose not just our own potential, but also the unique gifts that human consciousness could offer to the larger cosmic community. This was why so many different forms of intelligence were taking interest in human development, not because they wanted to control or save us, but because they recognized the value of what we might become. The beings who had been interacting with me over the years were essentially coaches and cheerleaders, offering support and encouragement while respecting our autonomy to make our own choices about our evolutionary direction. They couldn't do the work of consciousness evolution for us. That would defeat the purpose of the experiment, but they could provide inspiration and assistance for those humans who were ready to take responsibility for their own development. Through this cosmic council, I was given a clear understanding of my own role in this larger process. The podcast, the desert experiences, the conversations about consciousness, none of it was accidental. I had been prepared and positioned to serve as one of many bridges between ordinary human awareness and the expanded consciousness that was trying to emerge on our planet. But this wasn't a special mission that set me apart from others. Everyone had their own unique way of contributing to the collective awakening through art, science, parenting, healing, teaching, or simply embodying greater love and wisdom in their daily interaction. The key was recognizing that consciousness evolution was already happening through everyone, whether they were aware of it or not. My particular contribution was to help normalize conversations about expanded consciousness, to create cultural space for people to share their own extraordinary experiences, and to demonstrate that accessing cosmic awareness didn't require abandoning rational thinking or practical engagement with the world. As this cosmic transmission began to reach its completion, I experienced what could only be described as a download of information and capabilities that would support this work in the years ahead. Not mystical powers or supernatural abilities, but enhanced intuition, deeper compassion, clearer communication skills, and most importantly, unshakable confidence in the benevolent nature of the universe and the positive trajectory of consciousness evolution. I understood that while the challenges facing humanity were real and serious, the outcome was not in doubt. Consciousness itself was on our side, actively supporting our development, and the same intelligence that had guided the evolution of galaxies would not allow this precious experiment in aware embodiment to fail. But the support came with responsibility. Those of us who had been given glimpses of the larger picture were expected to live from that understanding, to make choices based on cosmic perspective rather than limited self-interest, and to use whatever platforms or influence we had to support the awakening of others.
This wasn't a burden, but an incredible privilege. To be conscious during this pivotal moment in human history, to participate directly in the evolution of awareness on a planetary scale, to contribute to the greatest transformation our species had ever attempted. There was no higher calling, no more meaningful way to spend a lifetime. As the cosmic council began to dissolve and the various forms of consciousness prepared to return to their own dimensional frequencies, I experienced a final transmission that felt like a benediction and a commissioning simultaneously. The love that emanated from these beings was beyond anything human relationships could provide, not because it was greater in quantity, but because it was completely unconditional, unattached to any particular outcome, free from any trace of neediness or agenda. They conveyed that this love was what I truly was, what all beings truly were, and what the universe itself was made of. Love wasn't just an emotion that consciousness sometimes experienced. It was the fundamental force that created and sustained all existence. Every form, every experience, every possibility was love exploring itself, expressing itself, celebrating itself through infinite creativity and play. This understanding transformed my entire relationship to existence. I no longer needed to search for love or meaning or purpose. I was love, I was meaning, I was purpose, temporarily expressing itself as Joe Rogan having adventures in consciousness on a small planet orbiting an ordinary star in one spiral arm of the Milky Way galaxy. But this wasn't an abstract philosophical concept. It was a lived reality that informed every breath, every thought, every interaction. When I could remember this truth, even difficult situations became opportunities to express love more creative. Challenges became chances to demonstrate that consciousness was more powerful than any temporary circumstances. As the gathering finally dispersed and I found myself alone again under the desert stars, I felt more complete and peaceful than ever before in my life. Not because all problems had been solved or all questions answered, but because I had directly experienced the love and intelligence that underlies all existence. And I knew beyond any doubt that this cosmic foundation could never be threatened or diminished by anything that happened at the surface level of experience. The remaining days of my desert retreat were spent in quiet integration, allowing this ultimate experience to settle into my nervous system and become accessible for practical application. I practiced moving fluidly between cosmic consciousness and ordinary human awareness, learning to access the larger perspective when it was helpful while remaining fully present to the immediate circumstances of desert camping. By the time I broke camp and began the drive back to Austin, I felt ready to begin a new phase of service that would draw on everything I had learned during years of consciousness exploration. The Cosmic Council had shown me that we were approaching a critical period in human development when those who had developed access to expanded awareness would play increasingly important roles in supporting collective awakening. This wasn't about becoming a spiritual teacher or abandoning my current work. It was about bringing cosmic consciousness into everything I was already doing. The podcasts, the relationships, the daily activities that made up ordinary human life. The goal was to demonstrate that expanded awareness enhanced rather than replaced normal human functioning. The months following that ultimate desert encounter have been unlike any period in my life. Not because of dramatic external changes. I still live in the same house, still do the same podcast, still have the same relationships and responsibility. But everything feels different now, infused with a depth and meaning that comes from knowing directly that we're all expressions of the same infinite consciousness exploring itself through countless forms. The integration has been gradual and gentle, like slowly adjusting to a new pair of glasses that allows you to see details that were always there but had been out of focus. I find myself approaching conversations with a quality of presence that creates space for people to access their own deeper wisdom. Guests on the podcast often comment that they've shared insights they didn't know they possessed, thoughts that seem to emerge from some source beyond their individual knowledge. But perhaps the most significant change has been in how I experience the ordinary moments that make up daily life. Making coffee in the morning, walking the dogs, sitting in traffic, these simple activities have become opportunities to practice conscious presence, to remember that awareness itself is the most extraordinary thing in existence, regardless of what particular forms it happens to be experienced. The desert continues to call me back regularly, though not with the urgent seeking energy that characterized my earlier trips. Now I go there to remember, to reconnect, to maintain my relationship with the expanded consciousness that those vast spaces naturally support. Sometimes there are visible encounters with lights or beings, sometimes just profound experiences of communion with the intelligence that pervades all natural systems. Each visit deepens my understanding that consciousness isn't something we possess, it's something we participate in. Like waves on the ocean that temporarily think they're separate from the water, individual awareness is just one expression of a much larger field of consciousness that includes everything from quantum particles to galactic clusters. This perspective has transformed how I understand not just my own life, but the larger human drama that's playing out on our planet. The political conflicts, the environmental challenges, the social inequalities. From the cosmic perspective, these are all growing pains as our species learns to operate from love-based consciousness rather than fear-based survival thinking. The beings I've encountered in the desert consistently convey that humanity is succeeding in this transition, even though it often doesn't feel that way from our limited ground-level perspective. They can perceive patterns and trends that operate over longer timescales than individual human lives, and from their vantage point the direction of human development is clearly positive. More people are meditating than ever before. More individuals are questioning materialist assumptions about reality. More communities are experimenting with sustainable ways of living that honor our connection to natural systems. More conversations are happening about consciousness, meaning, and our responsibility to future generations. These shifts are happening simultaneously at individual and collective levels, creating a resonance field that makes it easier for others to access expanded awareness. Each person who awakens to their true nature as cosmic consciousness makes it more likely that others will have similar awakenings. We're reaching a critical mass where consciousness expansion becomes self-reinforcing rather than requiring extraordinary circumstances or heroic individual effort. This understanding has given me tremendous hope and patience for the process of global awakening. Instead of feeling frustrated by how slowly change sometimes appears to happen, I can appreciate that we're participating in an evolutionary shift that operates according to organic timing rather than human impatience. My role in this larger process has become clearer as well. Through the podcast and other platforms, I'm here to help normalize conversations about expanded consciousness, to create cultural permission for people to share their own extraordinary experience, and to demonstrate that accessing cosmic awareness enhances, rather than replaces, practical human functioning. But beyond any specific work or platform, the most important contribution I can make is simply living from the understanding that was revealed during my desert encounter.
When I remember that consciousness is the fundamental fabric of reality and that love is the creative force that sustains all existence, my interactions naturally become more compassionate, more wise, more helpful to others. This isn't about achieving some perfect enlightened state, it's about gradually learning to embody cosmic consciousness through ordinary human activities. Sometimes I remember the larger perspective clearly. Sometimes I get caught up in temporary concerns and forget. But the remembering becomes more frequent and more stable as I practice, bringing expanded awareness into practical application. The children in my life have been particularly responsive to this shift in consciousness. Kids naturally exist in a more fluid relationship with reality anyway, less constrained by fixed beliefs about what's possible. When the adults around them operate from expanded awareness, it creates an environment where children feel safe to express their own intuitive wisdom and creative insight. I've watched my stepchildren and their friends navigate social challenges with remarkable wisdom when supported by adults who could hold space for their authentic expression rather than trying to force them into predetermined molds. They seem to arrive with capacities that previous generations had to work years to develop: greater emotional intelligence, more creative problem-solving abilities, deeper appreciation for environmental systems. This gives me tremendous hope for the future. Even if the current generation faces significant challenges in making the transition to expanded consciousness, we're laying the foundation for future generations who will find these capacities as natural as we found language acquisition or abstract reasoning. The beings I continue to encounter during my desert journeys express particular interest in these emerging human capacities. They convey that we're developing forms of consciousness that are rare in the galaxy, the ability to maintain individual creativity and autonomy while also participating in collective intelligence and cooperation. Most species throughout the cosmos develop either primarily as individual entities or as collective organisms, but humans are learning to balance both tendencies. This makes us valuable contributors to the larger galactic community of consciousness, offering perspectives and capabilities that complement what other forms of intelligence have to contribute. But they're also clear that this potential will only be realized if we can continue evolving beyond the survival-based thinking that has characterized most of human history. The environmental crisis, in particular, is seen as a crucial test of whether we can learn to make decisions based on long-term collective well-being, rather than short-term individual advantage. From the cosmic perspective, this crisis is actually an opportunity for rapid evolution. When species face existential challenges, they either develop new capacities quickly or face extinction. The environmental pressures we're experiencing are forcing us to develop forms of consciousness and cooperation that might have taken much longer to emerge under more comfortable circumstances. The key is responding to these challenges from expanded awareness rather than reactive fear. When we can maintain connection to cosmic consciousness while addressing practical problems, solutions emerge that serve both immediate needs and long-term sustainability. When we react from fear and separation, we create more problems than we solve.
This is why the consciousness work that so many people are doing individually is crucial for our collective future. Every person who develops the ability to access expanded awareness in daily life is contributing to our species' capacity to respond wisely to the challenges we face. And the beautiful thing is that this development feels good. Operating from cosmic consciousness isn't a burden or sacrifice, it's profoundly fulfilling because it aligns us with our deepest nature. When we remember that we're expressions of infinite love and intelligence, even ordinary activities become opportunities for joy and creativity. I think about this every time I return from the desert to resume my regular life in Austin. The transition from profound cosmic experiences to mundane human concerns could feel jarring, but instead it feels like coming home to another equally valuable expression of consciousness. talking with Jessica about our daily plans, recording conversations with podcast guests, walking through the city, and observing the complex dance of human civilization. All of it is cosmic consciousness playing with itself, exploring what it's like to be temporarily individual while never really losing connection to the infinite wholeness that is our true nature. This perspective makes everything precious, not just the dramatic, mystical experiences or the profound insights, but also the simple moments of connection, humor, curiosity, and care that make up the texture of human life. These aren't distractions from spiritual realization. They are spiritual realization consciousness celebrating its own infinite creativity through the beautiful limitations of embodied existence. As I've integrated this understanding more deeply, I find myself naturally sharing it through casual conversations, social media posts, and the way I approach my work and relationships, not as someone who has achieved some special enlightenment, but as someone who has been reminded of what we all truly are and wants to help others remember as well. The response has been remarkable. People from all walks of life reach out to share their own experiences of expanded consciousness, often expressing relief that there are spaces where these topics can be discussed openly and intelligently. Many describe feeling less alone in their spiritual exploration, more confident in trusting their own direct experiences of expanded awareness. This has led to the formation of informal communities of consciousness explorers in cities around the world. Not formal organizations with rigid structures, but organic networks of people who gather regularly to share experiences, practice techniques for accessing expanded awareness, and support each other's continued growth and development. These communities seem to be arising spontaneously wherever people are ready to move beyond purely individual spiritual practice toward collective exploration of consciousness. They serve as cultural bridges between the mystical insights that individuals discover in private and the practical applications needed to address shared challenges. What emerges from these gatherings consistently demonstrates that consciousness expansion isn't just personally fulfilling, it's also practical and beneficial for addressing real-world problems. Groups that practice accessing expanded awareness together often generate creative solutions to complex challenges that none of the individuals could have discovered alone. This suggests that the consciousness evolution we're experiencing isn't just a spiritual luxury for people who have already met their basic needs. It's actually an essential development that will determine our species' ability to create sustainable, just, and fulfilling ways of living together on this planet. The cosmic beings who have been observing and occasionally interacting with humanity seem to understand this better than most humans do. They consistently convey that our current environmental and social challenges aren't problems to be solved through better technology or political arrangements alone. They're symptoms of operating from limited consciousness, and they'll naturally resolve as we learn to make decisions from expanded awareness. This doesn't mean ignoring practical action or waiting for mystical transformation to solve everything magically. It means bringing cosmic consciousness into practical engagement with whatever challenges we face, allowing expanded awareness to inform our choices while remaining grounded in the immediate requirements of embodied existence. The beautiful paradox is that the more cosmic our perspective becomes, the more human we become. When we remember our true nature as infinite love and intelligence, we naturally become more compassionate, more creative, more effective in our relationships and work. Expanded consciousness doesn't separate us from ordinary life. It helps us engage with ordinary life more skillfully and joyfully. This is what the desert teachings have shown me most clearly. The vast silence under the stars, the encounters with luminous beings, the direct experience of cosmic consciousness, all of it has been preparation for bringing that expanded awareness into every moment of daily human existence. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, remember that you've been listening to more than just an interesting story about UFO encounters in the Nevada desert. You've been receiving a transmission about your own true nature as cosmic consciousness temporarily expressing itself through the beautiful limitations of human experience. The expanded awareness that I discovered under the desert stars isn't something separate from your ordinary consciousness. It's the deepest nature of ordinary consciousness itself.
The love and intelligence that pervades the galaxy is the same love and intelligence that's aware of these words right now, that dreams your dreams and experiences your life. You don't need to travel to remote locations or have dramatic mystical experiences to access this cosmic consciousness. It's always here, always now, always closer than your own breath. The only thing that ever seems to separate you from it is the belief that you're separate from it. As you drift towards sleep tonight, let yourself rest in the knowing that you are simultaneously a unique individual expression and an inseparable part of the universal intelligence that dreams all realities into existence. You are both beautifully human and cosmically divine, both a temporary wave and the eternal ocean from which all waves arise. Sleep deeply in the embrace of this truth. Let it nourish and restore you. Prepare you for another day of conscious participation in the magnificent mystery of existence itself. Your dreams tonight may carry you to dimensions of reality that aren't accessible during ordinary waking consciousness. Trust these journeys even if you can't remember them clearly upon awakening. Rest peacefully in the knowledge that you are eternally supported by forces more loving and intelligent than you can imagine, held by a cosmic community that celebrates your unique perspective and treasures your individual contribution to the symphony of consciousness, exploring itself through countless forms across space and time. The desert stars that witnessed my encounters with luminous beings are the same stars that shine down on you tonight, carrying the same message of love, the same invitation to remember your true nature, the same gentle encouragement to live from the expanded awareness that is your birthright as a conscious being in a conscious universe. Every breath you take connects you to every other living being on this planet. Every thought you think participates in the ongoing evolution of cosmic consciousness. Every moment of love or kindness or wonder you experience adds to the sum total of goodness in the universe. You are not separate from the stars or the galaxies or the vast mystery that underlies all existence. You are part of it, woven into it, essential to it, and somewhere out there under other skies, other forms of consciousness are having their own experiences of awakening, their own moments of connection to the infinite. The universe is dreaming, and you are one of its dreams. Rest well in that knowledge. Let yourself sink into the profound peace that comes from knowing you belong here, that your existence matters, that you are loved and supported by forces beyond your understanding. Sleep is just another form of consciousness, another way of participating in the cosmic dance of awareness. As you drift off tonight, remember that you're surrounded by mystery and magic, held by the same forces that hold the planets in their orbits and the stars in their course. Sweet dreams, fellow traveler in the grand adventure of consciousness discovering itself. May you rest well in the peace that surpasses understanding, the silence from which all sounds emerge, the love that creates and sustains all worlds. Until we meet again in the infinite spaces where all consciousness converges, sleep peacefully in the knowledge that you are exactly where you need to be, exactly when you need to be there, playing your unique and irreplaceable part in the universe's grand symphony of awakening.